World of Warcraft: The Last Guardian by Jeff Grubb. Chapter 4: Battle and Aftermath. The air rushed out of Calgar's lungs as he struck the ground. The earth was gritty beneath his fingers, and he realized he must have landed on a low dune of sandy debris collected along one side of the ridge. Uneasily, the mage rose to his feet. From the air, the ridge looked like a forest fire. From the ground, it looked like an opening to hell itself. The wagons were almost completely consumed by fire now, their contents scattered and blazing along the ridge. Bolts of cloth had been unwound in the dirt, barrels staved and leaking, and food despoiled and mashed into the earth. Around him were bodies as well, human forces dressed in light armor. There was an occasional gleam of a helmet or a sword. Those would be the caravan guards who failed their task. Calgar shrugged a painful shoulder, but it felt bruised as opposed to broken. Even given the sand, he should have landed harder. He shook his head hard. Whatever ache was left from Medivh's spell was outweighed by greater aches elsewhere. There was a movement along the wreckage, and Calgar crouched. Voices barked back and forth in an unfamiliar tongue, a language to Calgar's ears both guttural and blasphemous. They were searching for him. They had seen him topple from his mount, and now they were searching for him. As he watched, stooped figures shambled through the wreckage, foaming hunched silhouettes where they passed before the flames. Something tickled the back of Calgar's brain, but he could not place it. Instead, he started to back out of the clearing, hoping the darkness would keep him hidden from the creatures. Such was not meant to be. Behind him, a branch snapped, or a booted foot found a chuck hole covered by leaves, or leather armor was tangled briefly in some bush. In any event, Calgar knew he was not alone, and he turned at once to see a monstrosity from his vision, a mockery of humanity in green and black. It was not as large as the creature of his vision, nor as wide, but it was still a nightmare creature. Its heavy jaw was dominated by fangs that jutted upwards, and other features smaller and sinister. For the first time, Calgar realized it had large, upright ears, and probably heard him before saw him. Its armor was dark, but it was leather and not the metal of his dream. The creature bore a torch in one hand and caught the deep features of its face, making it all the more monstrous. In its other hand, the creature carried a spear decorated with this string of small white objects. With a start, Calgar realized the objects were human ears, trophies of the massacre around them. All this came to Calgar in an instant. In the moment's meeting of a man and monster, the beast pointed the grisly decorated spear at the youth and let out a bellowing challenge. The challenge was cut short as the young mage muttered a word of power, raised his hand, and unleashed a small bolt of power through the creature's midsection. The beast slumped on itself, its bellow cut short. One part of his mind was stunned by what he had done, the other knew that he had seen what these creatures could do in the vision in Karazhan. The creature had warned the other members of its unit, and now there were war howls in return around the encampment. 2, 4, a dozen such travesties, all converging on his location. Worse yet, there were other howls from the swamp itself. Calgar knew he did not have the power to repulse all of them. Summoning the mystic bolt was enough to weaken him. Another would put him in dire danger of fainting. Perhaps he should try to flee. But these monsters probably knew the darkened fen that surrounded them better than he did. If he kept to the sandy ridge, they would find him. If he fled into the swamp, not even Medivh would be able to locate him. Calgar looked up to the sky, but there was no sign of either the Magus or the Griffins. Medivh landed somewhere and was sneaking up on the monsters, or had he returned to the human forces to the south to bring them here? Or, thought Calgar grimly, had Medivh's quicksilver mood changed once again, and he had forgotten he had someone with him on this flight? Calgar looked quickly into the darkness, then back towards the side of the ambush itself. There were more shadows moving around the fire and more howling. Calgar picked up the grimly trophy sphere and strode purposely towards the fire. He might not be able to fire off more than a mystic bolt or two, but the monsters didn't know that. Perhaps they were as dumb as they looked, as unexperienced with wizards as he was with them. He did surprise them for what it was worth. The last thing they expected was their prey, the victim they had unseated from his flying mount, suddenly to manifest at the edge of the campfire's light, bearing the trophy spear of one of their guards. Khadgar tossed the spear sideways on the fire, and it sent up a shower of sparks as it landed. The young mage summoned a bit of flame, a small ball, and held it in his hand. He hoped that it lined his features as seriously as the torch had lit the guards. It had better. "Leave this place!" Khadgar bellowed, praying that his strained voice would not crack. "Leave this place or die!" One of the larger brutes took 2 steps forward, and Khadgar muttered a word of power. The mystic energies congealed around his flaming hand and blasted the green non-human full in the face. The brute had enough time to raise a clawed hand to his ruined features before it toppled. "Flee!" shouted Khadgar, trying to pitch his voice as deep as he could. "Flee or face the same fate!" His stomach felt like ice, and he tried not to stare at the burning creature. A spear launched out of the darkness, and with the last of his energy, Khadgar summoned a bit of air just enough to push it clearly aside. As he did, he felt faint. That was the last he could do. He was well and truly tapped out. It would be a good time for his bluff to work. The surrounding creatures, about a dozen visible, took a step back, then another. One more shout, Khadgar reckoned, and they would flee back into the swamp and give him enough time to flee himself. He already decided that he would flee south toward the army encampment. Instead, there was a high, cackling laugh that froze Khadgar's blood. The ranks of the green warriors parted and another figure shambled forward. It was thinner, more haunched than the others, and wore a robe the color of curdled blood, the color of the sky of Khadgar's vision. Its features were as green and misshapen as the others, but this one had a gleam of feral intelligence in his eyes. It held out its hand, palm upwards, took a dagger, and pierced the palm with the tip. Reddish blood pooled the clawed palm. The robed beast spoke a word that Khadgar had never heard, a word that hurt his ears, and the blood burst into flame. "Human wants to play," said the robed monster, roughly matching the human language. "Wants to play spells. Nothgrin can play." "Leave now!" tried Khadgar. "Leave now or die!" But the young mage's voice wavered now, and the robed mockery merely laughed. Khadgar scanned the area around him, looking for the best place to run, wondering if he could grab one of the guard's swords laying on the ground. He wondered if this Nothgrin was bluffing as much as Khadgar had been. Nothgrin took a step towards Khadgar, and two of the brutes to the spellcaster's right suddenly screamed and burst into flame. It happened with a suddenness that shocked everyone, including Khadgar. Nothgrin wheeled towards the immolated creatures to see two more join them, bursting into flames, like dry sticks. They screamed as well, their knees buckling, and they toppled to the ground. In the place where the creatures had been now stood Medivh. He seemed to glow of his own volition, diminishing the main fire, the burning wagons, and the burning corpses on the ground, sucking their light into himself. He seemed radiant and relaxed. He smiled at the collected creatures and was savage and brutal. "My apprentice told you to leave," said Medivh. "You should have followed his orders." One of the beasts let out a bellow, and the rogue Magnus silenced it with a wave of his hand. Something hard and visible struck the beast square in the face, and there was a shattering crack as its head came loose of its body and rolled backwards, shrinking to the ground only moments before the creature's body struck the stand. The rest of the creature staggered backwards a step, then fled entirely into the night. Only the leader, the robed Nothgrin, held its ground, and its over-wide jaw flapped open in surprise. "Nothgrin knows you, human," he hissed. You are the one. Anything else the creature said disappeared in a scream as Medivh waved his hand and the creature was pulled off its feet by a burst of air and fire. It was swept upward, screaming until at last its lungs collapsed from the stress and remains of its body burned drifted down like the blackest snowflakes. Khadgar looked at Medivh, and the wizard had a toothy, self-satisfied smile. The smile faded when he looked at Khadgar's ashen face. "Are you all right, lad?" he asked. "Fine," said Khadgar, feeling the weight of his exhaustion sweeping over him. He tried to sit up, but ended up just collapsing to his knees, his mind worn and empty. Medivh was at his side in a moment, passing a palm over the lad's forehead. Khadgar tried to move the hand away, but found that he lacked the energy. "Rest," said Medivh. "Recover your strength. The worst is over." Khadgar nodded, blinking. He looked at the bodies around the fire. Medivh could have slain him as easily in the library. What stayed his hand, then? Some recognition of Khadgar? Some bit of memory of humanity? The young mage managed those things. His voice sounded slurred. "What were they? What?" "Orcs," said the magus. "Those were orcs. Now no more questions for the moment." To the east the sky was lightening. To the south there was the sound of bright horns and powerful hooves. "The cavalry at last," said Medivh with a sigh. "Too loud and too late, but don't tell them that. They can pick up the stragglers now. Now rest." The trolls swept through the camp, half of them dismounting, the remainder pressing up along the road. The horsemen began checking the bodies. A detail was assigned to bury the members of the cavern. The few dead orcs that Medivh had not set fire were gathered, put on the main fire, the bodies charring as the flesh turned to ash. Khadgar didn't remember Medivh leaving him, but he did return with the patrol's commander. The commander was stocky, older man, his face weathered by combat and campaign. His beard had already more salt than pepper, and his hairline had receded to the back of his head. He was a huge man, made all the more imposing by his plate armor and great cape. Over one shoulder, Khadgar could see the hilt of a huge sword, the crosspiece huge and jeweled. "Khadgar, this is Lord Anduin Lothar. Lothar, this is my apprentice, Khadgar of the Kirin Tor." Khadgar's mind spun and caught on the first name, Lord Lothar. The king's champion, boyhood companion of both King Lane and Medivh, the blade on his back had to be the great royal sword pledged to defend Azeroth and... Did Medivh just say Khadgar was his apprentice? Lothar dropped to one knee to bring himself level with the young man and looked at him and smiled. "So, you finally got an apprentice. Had to go to the Violet Citadel to find one, eh, Med?" "Find one of suitable merit, yes," said Medivh. "And if it ties to the local hedge wizards, undies in bundle, so much the better, eh?" "Oh, don't look at me like that, Medivh. What has this one done to impress you?" "Oh, the usual," said Medivh, showing his teeth in a feral grin in response. "Organized my library, tamed a griffin on first try, took on those orcs single-handedly, including a warlock." Lothar let out a low whistle. "Organized your library? I'm impressed." A smile flashed beneath his graying mustache. "Lord Lothar," managed Khadgar finally, "your skill is known even in Dalaran." You rest, lad," said Lothar, putting the heavy gauntlet on the young mage's shoulder. "We'll get the rest of those creatures." Khadgar shook his head. "You won't, not if you stay on the road." The king's champion blinked in surprise, and Khadgar was not sure if it was because of his presumptions or his words. "The lad's right, I'm afraid," said Medivh. "The orcs have taken to the swamp. They seem to know the black morass better than we do, and that's what makes them so effective here. We stay on the roads, they can run circles around us." Lothar rubbed the back of his head with his gauntlet. Maybe we could borrow some of those griffin of yours to scout. The dwarves train the griffin. The dwarves that trained them may have their own opinions about loaning out their griffins, said Medivh. But you might want to talk to them, and the gnomes as well. They may have a few ringlings and swirlings and sky engines that might be more suitable for scouting. Lothar nodded and rubbed his chin. How do you know they were here? I encountered one of their advanced scouts near my domain, said Medivh, as calmly as if he was discussing the weather. I managed to squeeze out of him that there were a large party looking to raid along the morass road. I'd hoped to arrive in time to warn them. He looked at the devastation around them. The sunlight did little to help the appearance of the area. The smaller fires had burned out, and the air smelled of burning orc flesh. A plaid cloud hung over the site of the ambush. A young soldier, little more than Khadgar's age, ran up to them. They had found a survivor, one that was pretty badly chewed up but alive. Could the magus come at once? Stay with the lad, said Medivh. He's still a little woozy from everything. And with that, the master mage strode across the scorched and bloody ground, his long robes trailing him like a banner. Khadgar tried to rise and follow him, but the king's champion put his heavy gauntlet on his shoulder and held him down. Khadgar struggled only for a moment, then returned to a seated position. Lothar regarded Khadgar with a smile. So, the old coot finally took on an assistant. Apprentice, said Khadgar weakly, though he felt the pride rising in his chest. The feeling brought a new strength to his mind and limbs. He's had many assistants. They didn't last, or so I heard. Uh-huh, said Lothar. I recommended a few of those assistants, and they, came back with tales of a haunted tower and a crazy, demanding mage. What do you think of them? Khadgar blinked for a moment. In the past 12 hours, Medivh had attacked him, shoved knowledge in his head, dragged him across the country and Griffinback, and let him face off a handful of orcs before swooping in for the rescue. On the other hand, he had made Khadgar his apprentice, his student. Khadgar coughed and said, He's more than I expected. Lothar smiled again, and there was genuine warmth in his smile. He is more than anyone expected. That's one of his good points, Lothar thought for a moment and said, That is a very politic and polite response. Khadgar managed a weak smile. Lordaeron is very, politic and polite land. So I've noticed in the King's Council. Dalaran's ambassadors can say both yes and no at the same time. And say nothing as well. No insult intended. None taken, my lord, said Khadgar. Lothar looked at the lad. How are you? How old are you, lad? Khadgar looked at the older man. 17. Why? Lothar shook his head and grunted. That might make sense. Make sense how? Lord Magus Medivh, was a young man several years younger than yourself when he fell ill. As a result, he never dealt much with someone of your age. Ill? Said Khadgar. The Magus was ill. Seriously, said Lothar. He fell into a deep sleep. A coma, they called it. Lane and I kept him at Northshire Abbey, and the holy brothers there fed him broth and kept him from wasting away for years. It was like that, then snap. He woke right up, right as rain. Or almost. Almost? Asked Khadgar. Well, he missed a large piece of his teenage years, and a few additional decades as well. He fell asleep a teenager and woke up a grown man. I always worried that affected him. Khadgar thought about the master mage's merciful temperament. his sudden mood swings, and the childlike delight with which he approached battling the orcs. Were Medivh a younger man, would his actions make more sense? His coma, said Lothar, and shook his head at the memory. It was unnatural. Med calls it a nap, like it was perfectly reasonable. But we never found out why it happened. The Magus might have puzzled it out, but he's shown no interest in the matter, even when I've asked. I am Medivh's apprentice, said Khadgar simply. Why are you telling me this? Lothar sighed deeply and looked out over the battle-scarred ridge. Khadgar realized that the king's champion was a basically honest individual who would not last a day and a half in Darlaron. His emotions were playing on his withered open face. Lothar sucked on his teeth and said, To be honest, I worry about him. He's all alone in the tower. He has a Castilian, and there's cook, put in Khadgar. With all that magic, continued Lothar, he just seems alone. Tucked up there in the mountains, I worry about him. Khadgar nodded and added to himself, That is why you tried to get apprentices from Azeroth in there, to spy on your friend. You worry about him, but you worry about his power as well. Aloud, Khadgar said, You worry if he's all right. Lothar gave a shrug, revealing both how much he did worry and how much he was willing to pretend otherwise. What can I do to help? Asked Khadgar. Help him. Help you. Keep an eye on him, said Lothar. If you're an apprentice, he should spend more time with you, and I don't want him to fall into another coma, suggested Khadgar, at a time when these orcs are suddenly everywhere. For his part, Lothar rewarded him with another shrug. Khadgar gave the best smile he could manage. I'd be honored to help you both, Lord Lothar. Know that my loyalty must be to the Master Mage first, but if there's anything a friend would need to know, I will pass it along. Another heavy pat of the gauntlet. Khadgar marveled at how badly Lothar concealed his concerns. Were all the natives of Azeroth this open and guileless? Even now, Khadgar could see that there was something else Lothar wanted to speak of. There's something else, said Lothar. There's something else, said Lothar. Khadgar just nodded politely. Has the Lord Magus spoken of the Guardian to you? He asked. Khadgar thought of pretending to know more than he did, to draw out more from this older, honest man, but as the thought passed through his head, he discarded it. Best to hold on to the truth. I've heard the name from Medivh's lips, said Khadgar, but I know nothing of the details. Ah, said Lothar, then let it be as if I said nothing to you. I'm sure we will talk of it in due course, added Khadgar. Undoubtedly, said Lothar. You seem like a trustworthy sort. After all, I've only been his apprentice for a few days, said Khadgar lazily. Lothar's eyebrows raised. A few days, eh? Exactly how long have you been Medivh's apprentice? Counting until dawn. Tomorrow? Said Khadgar, and allowed himself a smile. That would be, 1. Medivh chose that moment to return, looking more haggard than before. Lothar raised his eyebrows in a hopeful question, but the Magus merely shook his head. Lothar frowned deeply, and after exchanging a few pleasantries, left to oversee the rest of the salvage and cleanup. The half of the patrol that had moved ahead along the road had returned, but found nothing. Are you up for travel? Asked Medivh. Khadgar pulled himself to his feet, and the sandy ridge in the middle of the black morass seemed like a ship pitched in a rough sea. Well enough, he said. I don't know if I can handle Griffin, though, even with... He let his voice trail off, but touched his forehead. It is just as well, said Medivh. Your mount got spooked by the arrows and headed for the high country. We'll have to double up. He raised the rune-carved whistle to his lips and let out a series of short, sharp blasts. Far above there was the shriek of a griffin on wing, circling high above them. Khadgar looked up and said, So, I'm your apprentice. Yes, said Medivh, his face a calm mask. I passed your test, said the youth. Yes. I am honored, sir, said Khadgar. I am glad you are, said Medivh, and a ghostly smile crest his face. Because now starts the hard part. Chapter 5. Sands in an Hourglass. I've seen them before, said Khadgar. It was 7 days after the battle in the swamp. With their return to the tower and a day of recovery on Khadgar's part, the young mage's apprenticeship had begun in earnest. The first hour of the day before breakfast, Khadgar practiced spells under Medivh's tutelage. From breakfast until lunch, and throughout lunch until supper, Khadgar would assist the master mage in various tasks. These consisted of making notes as Medivh read off numbers, running down the library to recover this book or that, or merely holding a collection of tools as the magus worked. Which is what he was doing at this particular moment when he finally felt comfortable enough with the older mage to tell him what he knew about the ambush. Seen who before? Replied his mentor, peering through a great lens at his current experiment. On his fingers, the master mage wore small pointed thimbles, ended in infinitely thin needles. He was turning something that looked like a mechanical bumblebee, which flexed its heavy wings as his needles probed it. The orcs, said Khadgar. I've seen the orcs we fought before. You didn't mention them when you first arrived, said Medivh, absently minded, his fingers dancing in odd precision, lancing the needles into and out of the device. I remember asking you what other races. There were no mention. Where have you seen them? In a vision, soon after I arrived here, Khadgar said. Ah, you had a vision. Well, many get them here, you know. Moros probably told you. He's a bit of a blabbermouth, you know. I've had one, maybe two. The one I'm sure about was on a battlefield, and those creatures, these orcs, were there, attacking us. Attacking the humans I was with. Said Medivh, the tip of his tongue appearing beneath his mustache as he moved the needles daintily across the bumblebee's copper thorax. And I wasn't here, continued Khadgar. Not in Azeroth or Lordaeron. Wherever I was, the sky was red as blood. Medivh bristled as if struck by an electric shock. The intricate device beneath his tools flashed brightly as the wrong parts were touched, then screamed, then died. Red skies, he said, turning away from the workbench and looked sharply at Khadgar. Energy intense and uncaring seemed to dance across the older man's dark brows, and the magus eyes were the green of a storm-tossed sea. Red, like blood, said Khadgar. The young man had thought he was becoming used to Medivh's sudden and merciful moods, but this struck him with the force of a blow. The older mage let out a hiss. Tell me about it. The world, the orcs. The skies, commanded Medivh, his voice like stone. Tell me everything. Khadgar recounted the vision of his first night there, mentioning everything he could remember. Medivh interrupted constantly. What were the orcs wearing? What was the world like? What was the sky on the horizon? Were there any banners among the orcs? Khadgar felt his thoughts were being dissected and examined. Medivh pulled the information from Khadgar effortlessly. Khadgar told him everything. Everything except the stranger. familiar eyes of the warrior mage commander. He did not feel right mentioning that, and Medivh's questions seemed to concentrate more on the red-skied world and the orcs than the human defenders. As he described the vision, the older mage seemed to calm down, but the choppy sea still remained beneath his bushy brows. Khadgar saw no need to upset the magus further. "Curious," said Medivh slowly and thoughtfully. After Khadgar had finished, the Master Mage leaned back in his chair and tapped a needle-tipped finger to his lips. There was a silence that hung over the room like a shroud. Then at last he said, "That's a new one. A very new one indeed." "Sir." "Medivh," reminded the Master Mage. "Medivh, sir," began Khadgar again. "Where do these visions come from? Are they hauntings of some past, or portents of the future?" "Both," said Medivh, leaning back in his chair, "and neither. Go fetch an ever a wine from the kitchen. My work is done for the day, and I'm afraid it's nearly time for supper, and this may take some explaining." When Khadgar returned, Medivh had started a fire in the hearth, and was already settling into one of the larger chairs. He held out a pair of mugs. Khadgar poured, the sweet smell of the red wine mixing with the cedar smoke. "Do you drink?" asked Medivh as an afterthought. "A bit," said Khadgar. It is customary to serve wine with dinner in the Violet Citadel." "Yes," said Medivh. "You wouldn't need to if you just got rid of the lead lining for your aqueduct. Now, you were asking about your visions." "Yes, I saw what I described to you and Morose." Khadgar hesitated for a moment, hoping not to further blacken the Castellan's reputation for gossip, then decided to press on. "Morose said that I was not alone, that people saw things like this all the time." "Morose is right," said Medivh, taking a long pull from the wine and smacking his lips. "A late harvest vintage. Not bad at all. That this tower is a place of power should not surprise you. Mages gravitate towards such places, and such places are often where the universe wears thin, allowing it to double back on itself, or perhaps even allow entry into the twisting nether and other worlds entirely." "Was that what I saw, then?" interrupted Khadgar. "Another world?" Medivh held up his hand to hush the younger man. "I am just saying that these are places of power, which, for one reason or another, become the seats of great power. One such location is here in the Red Ridge Mountains. Once long ago, something powerful exploded here, carving out the valley and weakening the reality around it." And Khadgar, and that's why you sought out? Prompted Khadgar. Medivh shook his head, but instead said, "That is one theory. You said there was an explosion long ago that created this place, and it made a place of magical power. You then came." "Yes," said Medivh. "That is all true, but if you look at it in a linear fashion. But what happens if the explosion occurred because I would eventually come here, and the place needed to be ready for me?" Khadgar's face knitted. "But things don't happen like that." "In a normal world, no, they do not," said Medivh. "But magic is the art of circumventing the normal. That is why the philosophy debates in the halls of the Kirin Tor are so much brabble and blow. They seek to place rationality upon the world and regulate its motions. The stars march in order across the sky, the seasons fall one after another with lockstep regularity, and men and women live and die. If that does not happen, it's magic. The first wrappings of the universe, a few floorboards are bent out of shape, waiting for industrious hands to pry them open." "But for that to happen in an area to be prepared for you," stated Khadgar, "the world would have to be very different than it seems," answered Medivh, which it truly is, after all. "How does time work?" Khadgar was not thrown as much by Medivh's apparent change of topic. Time? We use it, trust it, measure by it. But what is it? Medivh was smiling over the top of his cup. Time is a regular progression of instances, like sands through an hourglass, said Khadgar. Excellent analogy, said Medivh. One I was going to use myself. And then compared the hourglass with the mechanical clock. You see the difference between the two. Khadgar shook his head slowly as Medivh sipped on his wine. Eventually the mage spoke. No, you are not daft, boy. It is a hard concept to wrap your brain around. The clock is a mechanical solution of time, each beat controlled by the turning of the gears. You look at a clock and know that everything advances by one tick of the wheel, one slip of the gears. You know what is coming next because the original clockmaker built it that way. All right, so, said Khadgar, time is like a clock. Ah, but is time also not an hourglass? Said the older mage, reaching for one planted on the mantle and flipping it over. Khadgar looked at the timepiece and tried to remember it was there before he had brought up the wine, or even before Medivh reached for it. The hourglass also measures time, true, said Medivh. Yet here you never know which particle of sand will move from the upper half to the lower half at any instance. Were you to number the sands in the order... No. Were you to number the sands, the order would be slightly different each time. But the end result is always the same. All the sand has moved from the top to the bottom. What order it happens in does not matter. The old man's eyes brightened for a moment. So, he asked. So, said Khadgar, you're saying that it may not matter if you set up your tower here because an explosion created the valley and warped the nature of reality around it, or that the explosion occurred because you would eventually come here and the nature of the universe needed to give you the tools you wanted to say. Close enough, said Medivh. So what these visions are, then, are bits of sand, said Khadgar. Medivh frowned slightly, but the youth pressed on. If the tower is an hourglass, and not a clock, then there are bits of sand, of time itself, that are moving through it at any time. These are unstuck or overlapping each other, so that we can see them, but not clearly. Some of it's parts of the past, some of it's parts of the future. Could some of it be parts of other worlds as well? Medivh, now, was thinking deeply himself. If it's possible. Full marks, well thought out. The big thing to remember is that these visions are just that. Visions. They waft in and out where the tower clock they would move regularly and be easily explained. But since the tower is an hourglass, then they don't. They move at their own speed and defy us to explain their chaotic nature. Medivh leaned back in his chair. Which I, for one, am quite comfortable with. I could never really favor an orderly, well-planned universe. Khadgar added, But have you ever sought out a particular vision? Wouldn't there be a way to discover a certain future and then make sure it happened? Medivh's mood darkened. Or make sure it never comes to pass, he said. No, there are some things that not even a master mage... There are some things that even a master mage respects and stays clear of. This is one of them. But... No buts, said Medivh, raising and setting his empty mug on the mantelpiece. Now that you've had a bit of wine, let's see how that affects your magical control. Levitate my mug. Khadgar furrowed his brow and realized that his voice had been slightly slurred. But we've been drinking. Exactly, said the Master Mage. You will never know what sands the universe will throw in your face. You can either plan to be eternally vigilant and ready, ensuing life as we know it, or be willing to enjoy life and pay the price. Now try to levitate my mug. Khadgar didn't realize until this moment how much he had drunk, and tried to clear the mushiness from his mind and lift the heavy cremaic mug from the mantel. A few months later, he was heading for the kitchen looking for a broom and pan. In the evenings, Khadgar's time was his own, to practice and research as Medivh dealt with other matters. Khadgar wondered what the other matters were, but assumed they included correspondence, for twice a week a dwarf on Griffinback arrived at the topmost tower with a satchel and left with a larger satchel. Medivh gave the young man free license in the library to research as he saw fit, including the myriad of questions that his former masters of the Violet Citadel had requested. "My only demand," said Medivh with a smile, "is that you show me what you write before you send them." Khadgar must have shown his embarrassment, because Medivh added, "Not because I fear you'll keep something from me, young trust, but because I hate for them to know something that I had forgotten about." So Medivh plunged into the books. For Guzbag, he found an ancient, well-read scroll with an epic poem, its numbered stanza precisely detailing a battle between Medivh's mother, Egwene, and an unnamed demon. For Lady Delith, he made a listing of the moldering elven tomes in the library. And for Adola, he plunged through those bestiaries he could read, but could not push the number of troll species past 4. Khadgar also spent his free time with his lockpicks and his personal opening spells. He still sought to master those books that foiled his earlier attempts to crack them open. These tomes had strong magics on them, and he could spend an evening among his divinations before getting even the first hint what style of spell protected their contents. Lastly, there was the subject of the Guardian. Medivh had mentioned it, and Lord Lothar had assumed that the maggots had confined it to the young man, and backed off quickly when the King's Champion had found it not to be the case. The Guardian, it seemed, was a phantom, no more or less real than the time-skewered visions that seemed to move through the tower. There was a mention of a passing of a guardian, always capitalized, in this elven tome, and a reference in the Azeroth's royal histories of a guardian attending this wedding or that funeral, or being the vanguard of some attack, always present, but never identified. Was this guardian a position, or like Medivh's supposed near-immortal mother, a single being? There were other phantoms that orbited this guardian as well, an order of some sort, an organization. Was the guardian a holy knight? And the word Tirisfal was written in the margins of one grimoire, and then erased, such that only Khadgar's skill and examination told him what this was once written there was by the carving the pen had done in the parchment. A name of a particular guardian or an organization, or something else entirely. It was the evening that Khadgar found this word 4 days after the incident with the mug that the young man fell into a new vision, or rather, a vision snuck up on him and surrounded him, swallowing him whole. It was the smell that came to him first. A soft vegetable warmth among the molding texts, a fragrance that slowly rose into the room. The heat rose in the room, not uncomfortably, but as a warm, damp blanket. The walls darkened and turned green. The vines trestled up the sides of the bookcases, passing through and replacing the volumes that were there and spreading wide. Flat leaves, large pale moonflowers, and crimson star orchids sprouted among the stacked scrolls. Khadgar took a deep breath, but more for anticipation than fear. This was not the world of the harsh land the orc armies they had seen before. This was something different. This was a jungle, but it was a jungle on this world. The thought comforted him, and the table disappeared, and the books, and Khadgar was left sitting at a campfire with 3 other young men. They seemed to be about his age, and were on some sort of expedition. Sleeping rolls had been laid out, and the stew pot empty and already cleaned and drying by the fire. All three were dressed for riding, but their clothes were well tailored and of good quality. The three men were laughing and joking, though, as before, Khadgar could not make out the exact words. The blond one in the middle was in the midst of telling a story, and from his hand motions, one involving a nicely adorned, appointed young woman. The one on his right laughed and slapped his knee as the blond one continued his tale. This one ran his fingers through his hair, and Khadgar noticed that his dark hair was already receding. That was when he realized he was looking at Lord Lothar. His eyes and nose were his, and the smile just the same, but the flesh was not yet withered, and his beard was not yet graying, but it was him. Khadgar looked at the third man and knew it at once to be Medivh. This one was dressed in a dark green hunter's garb, his hood pulled back to reveal a young, mirthful face. His eyes were burnishing jade in the light of the campfire, and he favored the blond one's story with an embarrassed smile. The blond one in the center made a point and motioning to the young Medivh, who shrugged, clearly embarrassed. The blond one's story apparently involved the future Magus as well. The blond one had to be Lane, now King Lane of Azeroth. Yes, the early stories of the three of them had found their way even to the Violet Citadel's archives. The three of them often wandered through the borders of the kingdom, exploring and putting down all manner of raiders and monsters. Lane concluded his story, and Lothar nearly fell back over the log he was sitting on, roaring with laughter. Medivh suppressed a laugh to himself into his curled hand, looking like he was merely clearing his throat. Lothar's laugh subsided, and Medivh said something, opening his palm upward to make a point. Lothar did pitch backwards now, and Lane himself put his face in his hands, his body heaving in amusement. Apparently whatever Medivh said topped Lane's story entirely. Then something moved in the surrounding jungle. The three stopped their revelry at once. They must have heard it. Khadgar, the ghost at his gathering, felt. Something moved in the surrounding jungle. The three stopped their revelry at once. They must have heard it. Khadgar, the ghost at this gathering, more felt it instead. Something malevolent lurked at the borders of the campfire. Lothar rose slowly and reached for a great, wide-bladed sword laying in its sheath at its feet. Lane stood up, reaching behind his log and pulling out a double-headed axe, and motioned for Lothar to go one way, Medivh to go the other. Medivh had risen as well by this point, though his hands were empty. He, even at this age, was the most powerful of the three. Lane, with his broadaxe, lopped forward to one side of the campsite. He might have imagined himself as stealthy, but Khadgar saw him move with firm-footed deliberation. He wanted whatever was there at the edge to reveal itself. The thing obliged. Bursting from its pile of concealment, it was half again as tall as any of the young men, and for one instant he thought it was some gigantic orc. Then he recognized it from the bestiaries that Adola had him pursue. It was a troll, one of the jungle breed, its blue-hued skin pale in the moonlight, its long gray hair lacquered upright into a crest that ran from its forehead back to the nape of his neck. Like the orcs, it had fangs jutting from its lower jaw, but these were rounded, peg-like tusks, thicker than the sharp teeth of the orcs. Its ears and nose were elongated, prods of human flesh, as it was dressed in skins and chains made of human finger bones, danced on its bare chest. The troll let out a battle roar, baring its teeth and its chest in rage, and feinting with its spear. Lane swung at the outthrust weapon, but his blow went wide. Lothar charged from one side, and Medivh came up as well, eldritch energy dancing off his fingertips. The troll sidestepped Lothar's great sword and danced back another step when Lane shredded the air with his huge axe. Each step covered more than a yard, and the two warriors pressed the troll. Each time it retreated, it used the spear more as a shield than a weapon, holding the half two-handed and knocking aside the blow. Khadgar realized the creature wasn't fighting to kill the humans. Not yet. It was trying to pull them into position. In the vision, the young Medivh must have realized the same thing, because he shouted something to the others. But by this time it was too late, for two other trolls chose that moment to leap from their hiding places on either side of the combat. Lane, for all his planning, was the one caught by surprise, and the spear skewered his right arm. The broad axe's blade bit deep into the earth as the future king screamed a curse. The other two concentrated on Lothar, and now the warrior was being forced back, using his broad blade with considerable dexterity, foiling first one thrust then another. Still, the jungle trolls showed their strategy. They were driving the two warriors apart, separating Lane from Lothar, forcing Medivh to choose. Medivh chose Lane. From his phantom viewpoint, Khadgar guessed it was because Lane was already wounded. Medivh charged, his hands flaming, and caught the butt end of the troll's spear to the face, as the troll slammed the heavy haft against Medivh's jaw, then turned, and with one elegant motion, pummeled the wounded Lane. Medivh went down, and so did Lane, and the axe spun out of the future King Sovereign's hand. The troll hesitated a moment, trying to determine who to kill first. It chose Medivh. Sprawled on the ground at its feet, the closer of the two. The troll raised the spear, and the obsidian point glowed evil in the moonlight. The young Medivh choked off a series of syllables. A small tornado of dust rose from the ground and flung itself in the troll's face, blinding it. The troll hesitated for a moment and clawed at its dusty orbs with one hand. The hesitation was all Medivh needed, for he lunged forward, not with a spell, but with a simple knife. Plunged it into the back of the troll's thigh. The troll gave a scream in the night, stabbing blindly. The spear dug into where Medivh had been, for the young mage had rolled to one side and was now raising his fingertips, crackling. He muttered a word, and lightning gathered in a ball between his fingers and lanced forward. The troll jolted from the shock and hung for a moment, caught in the blue-limed seizure. The creature fell to its knees, and even then it was not done, for it tried to rise, its remedy red eyes burning with hatred for the wizard. The troll never got its chance, for a shadow rose behind it, and Lane's recovered axe gleamed briefly in the moonlight before coming down on the troll's head, bisecting it at the neck. The creature sprawled forward, and the two young men, as well as Khadgar, turned to the trolls battling with Lothar. The future champion was holding his own, but just barely. He had backed almost across the entire campsite. The trolls had heard the death scream of their brother, and one continued to press the attack as the other charged back to deal with the two humans. It let out an inaccurate blow as it crossed the campsite, its spear before it like a knight on horseback. Lane charged in return, but at the last moment veered to one side, dancing aside the spear point. The troll took 2 more steps forward, which brought him right up to the campfire itself, and where Medivh was waiting. Now the mage seemed to be full of energy, and lined by the coals before him, looked demonic in his demeanor. He had his arms wide, and he was chanting something harsh and rhythmic. And the fire itself leaped up, taking a brief animated form of a giant lion, and leaped on the attacking troll. The jungle troll screamed as the coals, logs, and ash wrapped around him like a cloak, and would not be shrugged off. The troll flung itself onto the ground and rolled first one way, then the other, trying to dampen the flames, but it did no good. Finally, the troll stopped moving entirely, and the hungry flames consumed it. For his part, Lane continued his charge and buried his axe in the side of the surviving troll. The beast let out a howl, but its moment's hesitation was all Lothar needed. The champion batted away the outthrust spear with a backhand blow, and then with a level, precise swing, cut the troll's head cleanly from its shoulders. The head bounced into the brush and was lost. Lane, though bleeding from his own wound, slapped Lothar on the back, apparently taunting him for taking so long to deal with his troll. Then Lothar put his hand to Lane's chest to quiet him and pointed at Medivh. The young mage was still standing over the fire, his hands open, but fingers looked like claws. His eyes were glassy in the surviving firelight, and his jaw was tightly clenched. As the two men, and the phantom Khadgar, ran over to him, the young man pitched backwards. By the time the pair reached Medivh, he was breathing heavily, and his pupils were wide in the moonlight. Warriors and Vision Visitor leaned over him as the young mage strained to push the words out of his mouth. "Watch out for me," he said, looking at neither Lane or Lothar, but at Khadgar, when the young Medivh's eyes rolled into his head and he lay very still. Lothar and Lane were trying to revive their friend, but Khadgar just stepped back. Had Medivh truly seen him as the other mage? The one with his eyes on the war-swept plains had? And he had heard him. Clear words spoken almost in the depths of his soul. Khadgar turned, and the vision dropped away as quickly as the magician's curtain. He was back in the library again, and he almost stumbled into Medivh himself. "Young Trust," he said Medivh, the version much older than the one laying on the ground in the vanished vision. "Are you all right? I called out, but you did not answer." Sorry, sir." Taking a deep breath. "It was a vision. I was lost in it, I'm afraid." Medivh's dark brows drew together. "Not more red sky. No more not more orcs or red skies?" he asked seriously, and Khadgar saw a touch of the storm in those green eyes. Khadgar shook his head and chose his words carefully. "Trolls. Blue trolls, and it was a jungle, I think it was this world. And the sky was the same." Medivh's concern deflated, and he just said, "Jungle trolls. I met some once down south in Stranglethorn Vale." The mage's features softened, as he himself seemed to become lost in a vision of his own. Then he shook his head. "But no orcs this time, right? Are you sure?" "No, sir," said Khadgar. He did not want to mention that it was that battle he was witnessing. Was it a bad memory for Medivh? Was this the time when he slipped into a coma? Looking at the older mage, Khadgar could see much of the young man from the vision. He was taller, but slightly stooped from his years and research, yet there was the young man wrapped within the older form. Medivh, for his part, said, "Do you have the Song of Aegwynn?" Khadgar shook his head himself out of his thoughts. "The Song of my mother," said Medivh. "It would be an old scroll. I swear I can't find anything here since you've cleaned. It is with the other epic poetry, sir." Khadgar, tell him about the vision, he thought. Was this a random event, or was it brought on by his meeting of Lothar? He was finding out things triggering visions. Medivh crossed the shelf and ran a finger along the scroll, pulled out the needed version, old and well-worn. He unwound it partway, checked it against a scrap of paper in his pocket, then rewound it and replaced it. "I have to go," he said suddenly. "Tonight, I'm afraid." "Where are we going?" asked Khadgar. "I go alone this time," said the elder mage, already striding toward the door. "I will leave instructions for your studies with Morose." "When will you return?" shouted Khadgar after his retreating form. "When I am back!" bellowed Medivh, taking the stairs two at a time. Already Khadgar imagined the Castellan already at the top of the tower, with his runic whistle and tamed griffin at the ready. "Fine," said Khadgar, looking at the books. "I'll just sit here and figure out how to tame an hourglass."